No one accuses, no one points to any mistake. Even so, guilt remains heavy and constant, as if something were always missing inside. Billy Graham observed that some of the hardest forms of guilt are not born from visible actions, but from internal demands that no one else can see. Life goes on, behavior seems correct, choices do not draw attention. Even so, there is a persistent feeling of owing something that cannot be explained. This reflection begins exactly at that unsettling point, when guilt exists without accusation, without evidence, without witnesses. This guilt is usually not tied to a specific error. The person tries to locate its cause, revisits decisions, recalls conversations, analyzes attitudes. Nothing concrete appears. There was no clear transgression, no obvious harm. Even so, the feeling of being at fault remains. The conflict arises from this absence of a visible cause. There is no one demanding repayment. There is no external consequence. Still, there is a constant inner weight, as if something needed to be corrected, adjusted, or compensated. The person feels they should be doing more, being more, responding better, without knowing exactly to what. Many live with this in silence, not because it is forbidden to talk about it, but because it is hard to explain. How do you talk about guilt when no one is accusing you? How do you justify a feeling that is not supported by clear facts? Often, the person concludes that the problem lies within themselves, that they may be too sensitive, too demanding, unable to relax. This guilt often blends with responsibility. The person is careful, attentive, committed. They do what needs to be done. They honor agreements. Precisely for that reason, the guilt feels even more unjustified. Everything is in order on the outside, but inside the sense of insufficiency remains. Over time, this experience begins to be treated as something normal, a personality trait, an excess of conscience, something that is simply part of who one is. The person learns to live with this inner pressure without questioning it. It does not stop life from moving forward, but it accompanies every choice as a constant background tension. This conflict is common and rarely recognized. It does not appear in moments of crisis, but in the in-between spaces, when everything is resolved and yet there is no relief, when the day ends and the impression arises that something was left undone, even without knowing what. Invisible guilt does not shout, it whispers. It does not accuse directly, but it insinuates. It leads the person to question their own worth, their own effort, their own right to rest. There is no evidence against them, but there is also no acquittal. And it is in this undefined space that many live, carrying a weight no one sees. And that, precisely because of that, seems even harder to let go. Billy Graham observed this type of guilt with great attention, precisely because it did not fit into the most common explanations. For him, not all guilt is born from a mistake that was made. Many times, it is born from an internal pattern of demand that is built over time, almost without being noticed. In the way he understood human nature, this invisible guilt was linked to how a person learns to evaluate themselves, not based on what they do wrong, but on what they believe they should be doing better. Life may be in order, behaviors appropriate, choices coherent, and still there can be a persistent sense of insufficiency. Billy Graham realized that many people carry an inner pressure that was not consciously chosen. It forms gradually, from absorbed expectations, elevated standards, constant comparisons, and an internalized idea that it is never enough. Guilt arises not from a clear failure, but from not reaching an ideal that is rarely questioned. For him, this state was especially common among responsible, attentive, and committed people, those who care about doing what is right, about not harming others, about meeting what is expected of them. Precisely because of that, they develop a constant inner vigilance. The conscience does not rest, it is always evaluating, reviewing, adjusting. In this condition, guilt ceases to be a response to a specific act and becomes an emotional backdrop. It accompanies simple decisions. It appears even when everything was done correctly. It does not point to a concrete error, but it sustains the feeling that something could have been better, more careful, more complete. Billy Graham did not see this as a sign of weak character or moral failure. He saw it as the effect of a conscience excessively oriented toward duty and insufficiently oriented toward personal listening. When a person evaluates themselves only by what they deliver, what they sustain, what they live up to, they lose contact with their own human limits. He understood that this kind of guilt grows stronger precisely because it encounters no external opposition. No one says the person failed. No one demands accountability. No one accuses. As a result, the inner demand gains absolute authority. There is no contrast, no questioning. The person begins to trust this demanding inner voice more than the reality around them. In Billy Graham's view, recognizing this type of guilt did not mean avoiding responsibility, but realizing that not every internal demand corresponds to a real failure. Some are simply old emotional habits maintained by fear of failing, of disappointing, of not being enough. He observed that while this guilt remains hidden, it silently governs the way a person lives. It defines how much rest they allow themselves, how much satisfaction they permit themselves to feel, how much they authorize themselves to acknowledge that they have done enough, not because there is an error, but because the internal measure is never complete. This understanding did not offer immediate relief. It did not bring easy absolution, but it opened an important space. The realization that feeling guilty does not necessarily mean being wrong. Sometimes it simply means the person has learned to demand more of themselves than they can sustain without wearing down. In modern life, this guilt finds many ways to remain active without being questioned. People live in environments that value performance, constant output, and emotional availability. Even when everything is functioning, there is a sense that it always could have been better, more attentive, more productive, more present. Work plays a central role in this, not only because of what it demands, but because of how it establishes internal standards. The person meets deadlines, solves problems, responds to what is asked. Still, the day ends with the impression that something was left unfinished. Not a concrete error, but a diffuse sense that it was not enough. This feeling does not come from direct external pressure, but from a silent comparison with an internal standard that is too high. Outside of work, the same logic continues. In relationships, the person wonders if they were careful enough, if they responded the right way, if they were available in the proper measure. Even when there is no conflict, guilt finds space. It shows up as constant review of what was said, what was not said, what could have been different. Modern life also reinforces this experience through continuous comparison. Other people's stories circulate constantly. Achievements, breakthroughs, images of well-managed lives. Against that backdrop, one's own experience always seems slightly lacking, not because something concrete is missing, but because the inner yardstick never rests. Many begin to confuse this guilt with responsibility. They believe that carrying this weight is a sign of care, awareness, maturity. They do not realize that little by little, it turns into permanent inner surveillance. The person does not allow themselves to fail, but also does not allow themselves to recognize when they have done enough. Even moments of rest become contaminated by this demand. Rest comes with discomfort, the sense that one should be doing something more useful, that stopping requires justification, that relaxing must be earned. In this way, guilt seeps even into the spaces where relief should exist. Perhaps you have felt this in simple moments. A calm day that ends with a sense of unproductiveness, a pleasant conversation followed by excessive analysis, a period without problems, accompanied by an unease that is hard to explain. There is no external accusation in these moments. The pressure comes from within. This is one of the most persistent forms of guilt in modern life. It does not arise from clear mistakes, but from internalized expectations. It does not paralyze life, but it stays close to it. And precisely because of that, it gradually becomes part of daily functioning, shaping the way a person relates to themselves, always with the feeling that something is still missing, even when no one else sees any lack at all. There are moments when no one else is watching, no external expectations, no immediate tasks, no visible demands. The day ends, and the person is left alone with themselves. It is in this space that guilt often remains, even without any apparent reason. There is no error to correct, no conversation to redo. And yet, the feeling of owing something does not dissolve. On the contrary, it gains more space when there are no distractions left to muffle it. Alone, the person mentally revisits the day. Small details return, a tone of voice, a response that may have been too quick, a silence that perhaps could have been different. None of this turns into a clear accusation. It simply feeds a vague sense of inadequacy. What is most unsettling is realizing that this guilt does not depend on recent events. Even on calm days, without conflicts or tension, it appears. Not as an organized thought, but as weight, a constant background that prevents full rest. In these moments, it becomes clear that the demand does not come from outside. No one is asking for more. There is no proof of failure. The demand is already installed within. It stays with the person even when everything stops. Guilt shows up as difficulty relaxing, as discomfort with one's own pause, as the feeling that being at rest needs justification. There is no external accuser, but there is an inner gaze that is too attentive, always evaluating. This is one of the few moments when a person realizes they have been carrying this weight for a long time. During the day, it blends into tasks. At night, when the pace slows, it becomes clearer. It does not shout. It does not accuse, it simply remains. There is no answer here, there is no explanation that resolves it. There is only the realization that this guilt does not depend on anyone's gaze. It continues to exist even when no one sees, no one demands, and no one expects anything. And that is precisely what makes it so difficult to understand, and so exhausting to carry. When this guilt persists for a long time without being recognized, it begins to shape the way a person relates to their own life. Not abruptly, but steadily. The person starts to live with the feeling that they never quite reach the point of deserving full rest. Everything they do feels provisional, insufficient, always open to revision. This state creates a silent, emotional wear. Energy is not consumed by external conflicts, but by continuous inner surveillance. The mind reviews attitudes, words, choices, even when there are no signs of error. The person learns to anticipate their own self-criticism, trying to do a little more to relieve a weight that never fully disappears. Over time, this guilt begins to affect how pleasure is experienced. Good moments do not deepen. There is always a sense that something more productive should be happening. Rest comes with discomfort. Satisfaction is short-lived. The person allows themselves to feel joy, but not for long, as if relaxing too much were risky. Billy Graham observed that this kind of guilt often produces a harsh relationship with oneself. The person becomes less tolerant of their own limitations. Small mistakes take on internal proportions far greater than they should, not because anyone else magnifies them, but because one's own conscience has turned into a space of constant demand. Ignoring this condition over the years can lead to a sense of exhaustion with no clear cause. The person feels tired even when they are not overloaded. The weight does not come from an excess of tasks, but from the inability to feel that what has been done is enough. There is always the impression that something was left incomplete, even when it is impossible to say what. This wear also affects identity. The person begins to define themselves by what still needs to be improved, corrected, or compensated for. Personal worth becomes tied to continuous effort, not to the recognition of what has already been given. This creates a permanent sense of inner debt, as if one's very existence required constant justification. At this point, invisible guilt stops being just an occasional feeling and becomes an emotional backdrop. It does not block decisions or paralyze action. On the contrary, it often pushes the person to do more, try harder, demand more of themselves. But this movement does not bring relief. It only keeps the cycle active. Perhaps the deepest effect is the difficulty of feeling at peace with oneself. Even when everything is in order, when there are no conflicts and no one is demanding anything, the person cannot access a lasting sense of calm. Not because they are wrong, but because they have learned to evaluate themselves by an internal standard that is never satisfied. This is the heaviest consequence of carrying a guilt no one sees. It does not appear as a visible mistake, but as a continuous wear that accompanies an entire life, making every pause uncomfortable and every achievement insufficient, simply because the inner demand never reaches an endpoint. At some point, almost unintentionally, a different perception begins to emerge. It is not a clear thought or a well-formed conclusion. It is simply the sense that this guilt is not tied to a specific error, but to a way of relating to oneself. The person starts to notice that the inner demand exists even when there is no external reason for it. This perception is not accompanied by immediate relief. It does not resolve the discomfort. It only changes the place from which it is observed. Guilt stops appearing as a logical response to something wrong and begins to be seen as a learned state, maintained over time, not because someone explicitly taught it, but because it became an internal habit. Billy Graham drew attention to this point of awareness as something delicate, not something to be rushed through or turned into a definitive explanation, simply something to be recognized. The difference between responsibility and constant self-accusation begins to become clearer. One protects, the other wears down. At this level of perception, the person starts to notice how this guilt has guided many of their attitudes: the excess of care, the difficulty of allowing rest, the feeling that it is never time to stop completely. There is no judgment in this, only observation, a more honest look at one's own inner functioning. This awareness also reveals something important. The guilt did not arise because the person failed, but because they tried, for a long time, to live up to internal expectations that were too rigid. Expectations that do not adapt to fatigue, to limits, to ordinary human condition. The weight does not come from error, but from the constant demand to never make one. Recognizing this does not eliminate guilt, but it changes the relationship with it. The feeling stops being proof of failure and becomes a sign of wear, an indication that the inner demand has gone beyond what can be sustained without causing inner harm. This layer of awareness does not ask for immediate decisions. It does not demand drastic changes. It simply invites noticing, to see that not every feeling of guilt carries a truth about who you are. Some carry only the history of how you learned to demand too much of yourself. Perhaps the heaviest form of guilt is not the one that comes from a real mistake, but the one that remains even when no one points out anything wrong. It does not accuse out loud. It does not demand explanations. It simply follows life as a constant weight. Billy Graham observed that many human conflicts are invisible to those on the outside. They take place within the person, where there are no witnesses and no external validation. It is in this space that old demands continue to operate, even when they no longer make sense. This reflection does not end here. It usually continues in ordinary moments, when the day ends and the feeling of being at fault returns without a clear reason, not to be quickly resolved, but to be observed more carefully, perhaps for the first time. I suggest that you subscribe to the channel to continue following reflections like this one, shared at a calm pace, with depth, focused on human experiences that often do not find words, always inspired by the attentive way Billy Graham observed the inner lives of people. This channel exists for those who feel the need to think more carefully, without haste and without ready-made conclusions. If, at any point in this video, you recognized yourself, the comments are open as a simple space for expression. It can be a short sentence, a restrained release, or simply a record of what lingered. Sometimes, putting that weight into words is already a way of not carrying it alone.